400, 1.50 GHz, 4 MB L2, 667 MHz FSB, low voltage. Core 2 Duo L7300, 1.40 GHz, 4 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB, low voltage. Core 2 Duo L7200, 1.33 GHz, 4 MB L2, 667 MHz FSB, low voltage. Core 2 Duo U7700, 1.33 GHz, 2 MB L2, 533 MHz FSB, ultra low voltage. Core 2 Duo U7600, 1.20 GHz, 2 MB L2, 533 MHz FSB, ultra low voltage. Core 2 Duo U7500, 1.06 GHz, 2 MB L2, 533 MHz FSB, ultra low voltage. Kentsfield 65nm process technology, 2 dual-core CPU dies in one package. Desktop CPU quad-core, SMP support restricted to 4 CPUs. Introduced the 13th of December, 2006. Same features as Conroe but with 4 CPU cores. 586 million transistors. LGA 775. Family 6, Model 15, Stepping 11. Variants Core 2 Extreme QX 6850, 3 GHz, 24 MB L2 cache, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Extreme QX 6800, 2.93 GHz, 24 MB L2 cache, 1066 MHz FSB, the 9th of April, 2007. Core 2 Extreme QX 6700, 2.66 GHz, 24 MB L2 cache, 1066 MHz FSB, the 14th of November, 2006. Core 2 Quad Q 6700, 2.66 GHz, 24 MB L2 cache, 1066 MHz FSB, the 22nd of July, 2007. Core 2 Quad Q 6600, 2.40 GHz, 24 MB L2 cache, 1066 MHz FSB, the 7th of January, 2007. Wolfdale 45nm process technology die shrink of Conroe. Same features as Conroe with the addition of 50% more cache, 6 MB as opposed to 4 MB. Intel Trusted Execution Technology. SSE 4 SIMD instructions. 410 million transistors. Variants Core 2 Duo E8600, 3.33 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8500, 3.16 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8435, 3.07 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8400, 3.00 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8335, 2.93 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8300, 2.83 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8235, 2.80 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8200, 2.66 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8135, 2.66 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E8190, 2.66 GHz, 6 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, no text, no VT. Wolfdale 3M, Intel Core 2, 45nm process technology, Intel Trusted Execution Technology. Variants Core 2 Duo E7600, 3.06 GHz, 3 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E7500, 2.93 GHz, 3 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E7400, 2.80 GHz, 3 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E7300, 2.66 GHz, 3 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Core 2 Duo E7200, 2.53 GHz, 3 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Yorkfield, 45nm process technology quad-core CPU. Die shrink of Kentsfield. Contains 2 Wolfdale dual-core dies in one package. Same features as Wolfdale. 820 million transistors. Variants Core 2 Extreme QX9770, 3.20 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1600 MHz FSB. Core 2 Extreme QX9650, 3.00 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Quad Q9705, 3.16 GHz, 23 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Quad Q9700, 3.16 GHz, 23 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Quad Q9650, 3 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB. Core 2 Quad Q9550, 2.83 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q9550S, 2.83 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q9450, 2.66 GHz, 26 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q9505, 2.83 GHz, 23 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q9505S, 2.83 GHz, 23 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q9500, 2.83 GHz, 23 MB L2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP, no text. Core 2 Quad Q 9400, 2.66 GHz, 23 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 9400S, 2.66 GHz, 23 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 9300, 2.50 GHz, 23 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8400, 2.66 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8400S, 2.66 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8300, 2.50 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8300S, 2.50 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8200, 2.33 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 95 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 8200S, 2.33 GHz, 22 MBL2, 1333 MHz FSB, 65 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 7600, 2.70 GHz, 21 MBL2, 800 MHz FSB, no SSE4, no Q7600 listed here. Intel Core 2 Quad Mobile Processor Family 45nm Process Technology Quad Core CPU. Variants Core 2 Quad Q 9100, 2.26 GHz, 26 MBL2, 1066 MHz FSB, 45 WTDP. Core 2 Quad Q 9000, 2.00 GHz, 23 MBL2, 1066 MHz FSB, 45 WTDP. Pentium Dual Core. Allendale, Pentium Dual Core, 65nm Process Technology Desktop CPU, SMP support restricted to 2 CPUs. 2 cores on 1 die. Introduced the 21st of January, 2007. SSSE3 SIMD instructions. 167 million transistors. Text, enhanced security hardware extensions. Execute disable bit. EIST, enhanced Intel SpeedStep technology. Variants Intel Pentium E2220, 2.40 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E2200, 2.20 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E2180, 2.00 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E2160, 1.80 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E2140, 1.60 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Wolfdale 3M, Pentium Dual Core, 45nm process technology. Intel Pentium E6800, 3.33 GHz, 2 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E6700, 3.20 GHz, 2 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E6600, 3.06 GHz, 2 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E6500, 2.93 GHz, 2 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E6300, 2.80 GHz, 2 MB L2, 1066 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5800, 3.20 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5700, 3.00 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5500, 2.80 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5400, 2.70 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5300, 2.60 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E5200, 2.50 GHz, 2 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Pentium E2210, 2.20 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Celeron, 64-bit core microarchitecture. Allendale, Celeron, 64-bit core microarchitecture, 64nm process technology. Variants Intel Celeron E1600, 2.40 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E1500, 2.20 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E1400, 2.00 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E1300, 1.80 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Does it exist? Intel Celeron E1200, 1.60 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Wolfdale 3M, Celeron, 64-bit core microarchitecture, 45nm process technology. Variants Intel Celeron E3500, 2.70 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E3400, 2.60 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E3300, 2.50 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron E3200, 2.40 GHz, 1 MB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Conroe L, Celeron, 64-bit core microarchitecture, 65nm process technology. Variants Intel Celeron 450, 2.20 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron 440, 2.00 GHz, 512 KB L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron 430, 1.80 GHz, 512 kilobytes L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron 420, 1.60 GHz, 512 kilobytes L2, 800 MHz FSB. Intel Celeron 200